May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved, and he who watches over you will not fall asleep. Behold, he who keeps watch over Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand, so that the sun may not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. It is he who shall keep you safe. The Lord shall watch your going out and your coming in from this time forth forevermore. The psalm for this morning, Psalm 21, is one that many of us may be familiar with, at least in part. And so this morning I want to reflect with you on a few aspects of the psalm as we move deeper into our Lenten journey. And I want to start with the first two verses, which are probably the most familiar from this psalm. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. You know, I've heard folks in various times and places say, well, just look to the hills, as a shorthand way of saying, look for God's help. But this shorthand kind of obscures that the hills aren't actually related to the help at all. That first part is a question born out of seeking, a question born out of need, a question sometimes born out of desperation or exhaustion. The image that I often hold in my mind when I think about these first two verses is that of when Kristen and I would hike to Stony Ledge on Mount Greylock. Right before you get to Stony Ledge, there's this last steep little push. And inevitably, no matter how many times we've hiked it, I stop before that little steep push and put my hands on my hips and sigh. I see the top, I see the hills, but how am I gonna get up there? That's the image of this first verse of, I look to the hills, from where is my help to come? It's a question asking, how am I going to make this next step? How am I going to get to where I need to be? And that answer is what is the core of our good news this morning. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. There's a lot of different conjecture and guessing about what the context for this psalm is. It's labeled as a psalm of ascent, and so is sometimes understood to be a psalm that was sung on a pilgrimage on the way to Jerusalem. And so in that context, the hills that the psalmist would be talking about would be the hill on which Jerusalem, the temple, Zion, the presence of God dwells. And so as they're going on their journey, the psalmist and those they travel with are saying, I see God. I look up my eyes and I see God, but how are we going to get there? How are we going to reach that place of God's presence? How are we going to reach that temple, that place where God's presence is so sure and so present that the very ground itself is holy? As we continue our Lenten journey this year, where are you heading? I mean, yes, as a Christian community, our Lenten journey takes us to the hill of Golgotha, to the hill of Calvary. But for you, today, this week, this Lenten season, what hill are you going to? Where do you see God's presence? Where do you know that God is, but don't quite know how you're going to get there? The only answer, the only way we will reach any place of God's presence is through the help of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. There are also those, though, who wonder if the hill that that the psalmist was talking about is an embodiment of the danger of whatever journey they were on. If you look over at the map that Drew is going to be using for our talk about geography in the Bible, you'll see that the Holy Land is full of hills and mountains. And these were treacherous journeys. The mountains and hills were treacherous travel, full of the danger of both robbery and also of falling off the road off the side of the cliff. And so perhaps the hill is the dangers you see ahead. God, I know that you're calling me, but I see these hills in my way. I see the danger. I see the possibility of traps. I see the possibility that I won't make it. How am I supposed to have the courage to keep on this journey? And the answer, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And our question and our striving and our wondering how we will ever live up to the call that God puts in front of us, and our sorrow and our despair and our fear about how will we ever make it safely through the path that God puts before us, the answer always starts with our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And as we continue to look at this psalm, you may notice that the psalm kind of goes in couplets, in 2 verses. The 8 verses are split up into 2 verses. So the first 2, we start with our foundation. As God's people, we receive our help from the Lord. But then we're also reminded in the coming verses that God's presence is not just on that hill in Jerusalem. God's presence is not just at this destination that we're going, but God's presence, God's saving grace, God's mercy is with us now. The psalmist continues, He will not let your foot be moved. The one who watches over you will not fall asleep. The one who watches over Israel, all of Israel, will never slumber nor sleep. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. That yes, as we travel towards the place where we know God and meet God most deeply, God travels with us. And all of our going out and coming in, God's constant presence is with us. As we look at these verses, you may notice the repetition of the word keeper. This word, the root word, appears about 6 times in these 8 verses, that God keeps us, God holds us. Some translations say God guards, God preserves. That on the journeys of our lives, whether we're in the easy parts or the parts that are a little more dangerous, whether we're in the parts where we can see clearly or the parts where we can't quite see where the next safe footstep should be, God holds us and keeps us. And this keeping is not some passive like, oh yeah, God's looking out, but it's a holding, it's a keeping, it's an active presence of God. And this presence of God is one that we hold on to with faith and hope, remembering how we've come this far by faith, that we have gotten to the point where we are because of God's constant presence. And because of that, we have faith that God will continue with us in the coming parts of our journey. As folks have talked about and written about this psalm and wondering and conjecturing about what context it was used, one of the ones that is most clearly agreed upon is that it was some kind of liturgical act. So there's one school of thought that says perhaps it was used before the beginning of a journey, where the person or a group who were going on this pilgrimage would gather with the community that was stayed behind. And someone would start out beginning the liturgy. The people who were leaving was called out beginning the liturgy. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And then the whole community would join in the rest of the song, assuring the travelers, reminding the travelers of God's steadfastness, of God's love, of God's mercy. That as they were preparing to go on their journey, those who were staying behind as well as those who were departing were reminding each other and holding each other in the strength that God is with you and will be with you every step of the way. Another guess that folks sometimes talk about is that this was used as folks were walking on the journey. That as the sojourners, as the pilgrimages were going, they called out, the leader called out, starting a call and response, using verse by verses. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where is my help to come? People responding, my help comes from God, the maker of heaven and earth. And back and forth, they would encourage themselves and each other on their journey. No matter what the context was, it seems clear that this psalm is one of both individual strength, but also community encouragement. That we need each other to remind ourselves and to remind each other that God is with us, that God's love for us goes before and behind us and is a sure foundation on which we can stand. We need each other to sing out our voices loudly that because God so loved the world, we can move with confidence. Yes, even through the treacherous, cliffy, rocky paths of the mountains. One of the most interesting that I saw that I hadn't really thought about before was wondering if this particular psalm was used as a bit of a question and answer, catechism-ish, but not really catechism, declaration of faith, where the first verse of each couplet was heard as a question, and the second verse of each couplet as a faithful, bold declaration of assurance. So imagine, if you will, getting ready to go on this journey or being on this journey and being weary, being the one saying, where is our help to come from? And someone replying, that the answer to that question is, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And then asking that question, are we sure that God would not let our foot be moved? Because I saw Joseph back there and he almost slipped and fell off the mountain. So are we really sure about this? When I look through my life, I've seen places where it felt like God was asleep. Are we sure that God is watching us? And the answer, behold, the one who keeps watch over Israel never slumbers or sleeps. No, but are you really sure that God watches over you? That the sun is not going to beat down on you? Because, I almost passed out in the desert earlier today when we were walking. Because, this road is weary because I am parched by the beating down of the sun. Are you sure that God is protecting and covering and watching us? Yes, we are sure that the sun will not strike you by day or the moon by night. Are you sure that God shall preserve you from all evil, that my life is secure in God's hands? Are you sure that God's preserving grace and mercy is greater than anything we will ever face? Yes, we are sure that God watches over us no matter where we're going out and coming in. Not just now, but will in the future. This psalm is the psalm of assurance and hope, a psalm of encouragement in those times when our steps are a little treacherous, and in those times when we are sure but need to encourage others. And one of the parts of this psalm that I think may be the hardest for some of us this morning is to admit even that we are dependent utterly on God. One writer, Robert Fisher, wrote that there is a blessing in moments when we become aware of our powerlessness. That in such times we are not necessarily less powerful than usual or more powerless than usual. Rather, we are stripped of all illusions of our own power that we possess. These are moments when our illusion of power is stripped away, and we are blessed to suffer the reality that we need help beyond ourselves. Though it is uncomfortable, it is a blessing to be able to live in the truth that only God is our source and strength. I had the privilege of hearing many people share their story of recovery through the 12 steps, and I've heard many stories of folks who say that first step of admitting powerlessness over the addiction, that first step of admitting that their lives had become unmanageable was one of the hardest steps to take. We are a people in our culture who like to be seen as competent, as able to do what needs to be done, as full of power. And so this morning, the invitation to admit our powerlessness is one that may be hard for us. And yet, it is the only way that we can fully dig ourselves into this journey and stand sure on God's foundation. It is because of admitting our own powerlessness that we are able to sing more fully and with more joy that God, you are the source of all that I have and need. As I was thinking about this psalm, I couldn't help but think about my senior year in college when I served as a chapel assistant at Sisters Chapel. Every service, the benediction, the end of the service, went like this. The piano player would begin to play these chords that were familiar to those gathered. And we would lift our voice and sing, Lord, I will lift mine eyes to the hills, knowing my help is coming from you. Your peace you give me in times of the storm. You are the source of my strength. You are the strength of my life. I lift my hands in total praise to you. As the music continued, Dean Rhodes would pray her final prayer over the gathered congregation. would pray her prayer over students who have been struggling with mental health, students who were struggling to financially pay for college, students who were dealing with death back home, students who were dealing with their own health issues, students who were lifting their hands saying, God, you are the only reason I'm standing here today. Inevitably, as we went back to that chorus, you are the source of my strength, you are the strength of my life, we would inevitably lift our hands in praise, lifting our hands in surrender, lifting our hands, acknowledging our own powerlessness. And it was in those moments that we were then able to sing what I think is one of the most glorious amens in all of gospel music. If you've never heard this song, please go and listen to Total Praise by Richard Smallwood. The amen at the end of the song, that repeats a couple times, but the amen is one of those most fulfilling declarations of let it be so. Let me live my life, God, that I believe that you are the source of my strength. Amen. Let me live my life, God, that my entire life is lived in total praise to you. Amen. Let it be so that this Lenten season, we allow ourselves to set aside our own sense of importance and power and to raise our hands with humility and faith, lifting our eyes to the hills, knowing that God is the source of our help, that in the midst of the storm, God is our peace. God is the source and strength of our life. And may we lift our hands in total praise to God. Amen.